Hey guys, so with the terror attack in Magdeburg, Germany, at a Christmas market by an Islamist terrorist, he definitely was an Islamist terrorist because he screamed Allahu Akbar right before his demise. I wanted to check out this epic debate, is Islam a religion of peace, between Douglas Murray, Aayan Hirsi Ali, and then two Muslims or two experts on the subject voting that Islam is. And obviously, Douglas Murray and Aayan Hirsi Ali are saying that Islam is not. Check it out.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm surprised by the motion itself. When I first had it, it reminded me of the academic question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And I'd think, well, if you do the salsa or the cha-cha, not many. Why are we not having a motion on, is Christianity a religion of peace? Is Judaism a religion of peace, etc.? Because those would be academic motions. Unfortunately, the motion, Islam is a religion of peace, is not academic. I respect and admire Ziba Khan. And I want to acknowledge the fact that you indeed are a demonstration of the assimilation of a Muslim individual, a Muslim woman, into Western society, into an American society, that you come from a middle-class family that was very eclectic and respected pluralism. I respect that very much, and I admire you for it, and I think you are an example to others. However, I disagree with you that you represent Islam or that you speak for Islam. The problem that is inherent in Islam from the time of its foundation up to this moment is who speaks for Islam. And I'll get to that later on. Is it Ziba Khan or is it Faisal Shahzad, who was also a middle-class man, went to business school, married an American woman, had 2 children, lived just like you, like many of you. And yet, he made a different choice based on a combination of piety and politics. And that's what Islam is. And before I go on, let me define the key terms of the motion. First, religion. The most common definition of religion you will find is the universal quest of humans in search of the sacred or the holy. That search is expressed intellectually, it's expressed in practice, it is expressed in fellowship. And you look at a religion like Islam, on an intellectual level, it was expressed by the founder of Islam as a demolition of all other gods. Polytheism had to end, and all humanity had to be united under one God. From those of you who are familiar with history, and I think a crowd like this is, you know that no monotheistic religion can be a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is a religion of peace, and definitely not Islam. Monotheistic religions know periods, lengthy periods of peace, but they also know lengthy periods of war. In terms of practice, yes, in Islam, you practice charity, you go to Hajj, you pray, all of that. But in terms of practice, there's also the expression, there's the concept of jihad. And I find it a pity that Ziba Khan did not mention that concept, which is central to Islam's conquests and Islam's success. The founder of Islam, Muhammad, in his lifetime, conducted 65 campaigns of war that were all successful. And that militaristic history of Islam is well documented. Just go Google it. And if you don't find it on Google, go to all those former empires that were conquered. The combination of a history of empire, of conquest, also leaves a legacy behind. And that legacy is the thrusting together of people of different ethnicities, languages, etc. So even if that empire declines, the likelihood of conflict, of war, is probable, it's high, especially where there is a fault line. That's where Samuel Huntington had a point. That history of militarism, combined with the legacy of empire, those 2 points alone belie the motion tonight that Islam is a religion of peace. But that's not all. When empires decline, those who are defeated, and the Muslim empire declined, those who are defeated sometimes find themselves in a state of victimhood. That state of victimhood is exploited by the leadership or those self-appointed leaders of Islam. And what do you see? You see a number of people, and I concede it's a minority, who believe that Islam is under siege. A mentality of victimhood tells those who are conquered, who are vanquished, that the problem was caused by external powers, not by us. And that systematic denial within Islam after the 19th century to blame only outsiders, exempt Islam from blame, from the explanation, what went wrong. Yes, it was external. Yes, Muslims were humiliated. Yes, they were conquered. Yes, they were colonized. But how much was also because of the flaws of Islam? And that takes me to the point of absolutism. When the West went into its scientific revolution, why wasn't it Muslims? Muslims were the first scientists, arithmetic, logic, etc. They were great. Why didn't they get into that scientific revolution? Why were they left behind? Was it only because of external factors, or were there internal flaws? That combination of a status of victimhood and the absolutism, the demand that you can never revise or reflect on the Quran, that you can never, never, ever refute what Muhammad said, you can only follow his example. That absolutism, combined with that status of victimhood, is also enlarges the likelihood of conflict. And those two combined, like the other two factors,
Aayan Hirsi Ali, your time is up.
Thank you. That belies the motion. I'll keep my last two factors for the time I have remaining. Thank you.
So I think her point is pretty valid. Why was Islam, this originally very scientific, very innovative, back in Spain and other areas and other time periods during the 1400s, etc., why were they left behind when the West and the rest of the world essentially advanced? Why are they still left behind in 2024? Why is Iran and all of these Islamist countries trying to bring back an Islamic caliphate, trying to bring the Muslim world back into the Stone Age and combat technology? Simply because the West and Islam are not compatible. Because if you are going to stick to Islamic doctrine and Sharia law, you're going to have major problems with the West. And that's an obvious thing to me and probably to anyone that has studied Islam at all. And now let's go to Douglas Murray's part of the debate. I'm sure that he will wipe the floor with these Islamists.
You said that your study of the Quran, you said this in print, made you an atheist.
That's right. I said Muhammad made me an atheist. The publisher said at the time, that's a pretty provocative headline. I said, well, get somebody to do the next one. She said, I could find a Catholic who could say Muhammad made me a Catholic. I said, how about trying to make it a three-part article and get a third one, somebody saying Muhammad made me a Jew? And that one would be the trouble.
Douglas Murray, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm sorry to make this panel rather Brit-centric after my colleague Majid. This isn't an attempt by us to have a British takeover of the old colony or anything like that. But I was coming earlier from my own fallen empire, referring back to my friend and colleague Aayan's comments earlier, and I was reading the paper, as I'm sure all of you were doing earlier today. Majid finished his comments by talking about the importance of changing paradigms. I'm not sure this is about paradigms. I think it's about facts. Here are some facts in my newspaper earlier. The Times Square bomber, of course, a man just up the road from here who tried to kill thousands of people. Only, by the way, didn't manage it because he set the 24-hour timing device to 7 a.m. instead of 7 p.m. 1900 hours was what it was meant to be. If he had have got that bit right, thousands of New Yorkers would have died earlier this year again. I see further in the paper 12 suspects arrested in France in a network trying to recruit people to go and fight American and other troops in Afghanistan. I turn to another page of the newspaper and the city I've just flown off from this morning, a Muslim London Underground worker who was, had written to his wife, who's off to try to become a martyr for Allah, as he says. He says, more than anything, I wish Allah to grant me martyrdom. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at facts. We should also just quickly, if I may, refer something to the wording of tonight's debate. Aayan's already mentioned this, but I mean, let me put it this way. You're I'm sure, a liberal-minded New York audience, or at least I hope you are. We'll see. But I imagine that if the motion we had here tonight was Christianity is a religion of peace, we get to the Q&A, perhaps even before, and somebody would say, if the other side were arguing for that, somebody would say, what about the Crusades? What about that? And then there'd be some other clever clogs who'd say, what about that Florida pastor the other week? That was a nasty business. That's Christianity for you. If we'd had tonight, Judaism is a religion of peace, the other side were trying to argue that. Sure as anything. There'd be people popping up in the hall tonight saying, oh, there's this bit in one of the Old Testament books, really, really bad. All sorts of massacres going on. Why don't you talk about that? There might even be people trying to say that, the argument that Judaism was a religion of peace couldn't be argued because people would say, look at what Israel is doing, and isn't that a direct response, and so on. So let's not have a debate about Islam and whether or not Islam is a religion of peace without talking about the facts to do with Islam. It's an absurd situation we're in, where nothing that anyone does whilst being Muslim is any responsibility of Islam's. Yet anything anyone does whilst being a Christian or a Jew is responsibility of all Christians, all Jews. Let's make this as straightforward as I can. Take the categorization that eminent scholars like Bernard Lewis, Ibn Waraq have made. Let's say Islam is a very, very complex thing. And the best way I can do this in the very short time I have is say you have three Islams. Islam 1, 2, and 3. Islam 1, the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Hadith. Islam 2, the tradition of the Sharia. Islam 3, what Muslims do now. The first of those things, Islam, the Quran, and so on, is bad. It is bad. There is a lot of violence in it. And what's worse, the peaceful verses are superseded by the violent verses. The violent verses also, sadly, are more numerous in number. Then you've got the life of Muhammad. Again, a bad man. A very bad man, it has to be said. Not a great role model, if you look at it. Takes child brides, abuses a small girl, multiple wives, himself a warrior, himself a war criminal, himself beheads Jews. This, I would have thought, would be a signal of not great peacefulness. Then you've got the tradition of the Sharia. Again, not great peacefulness. Still, no schools of Sharia that people in this hall would want to submit to. And thirdly, what Muslims do now. Thankfully, there is some hope in that one. Because most Muslims, thank goodness, I almost said thank God, but old habits die hard. Most Muslims don't do what those texts say because they exercise their judgment as moral beings without having to refer to defunct holy books. Now look, I wish that Zebra and Majid were the spokespeople of Islam. It would be lovely, although in Majid's case it would have taken rather too long if everyone had to go for 14 years preaching the downfall of America and then said, no, not so much. But we are where we are. Anyhow, I wish they spoke for Islam. It would be great. But the fact is that tonight, the organisers of this debate asked a number of clerics. None of them would show. Specifically, they wouldn't show and debate against Aayan Hirsi Ali. Myself, I don't think they cared. But But no, it's very interesting that they will not debate. Time and again, the actual leaders of your religion will not debate this. And you're left with people like we have here. The reason why is, of course, is that the leaders of the religion show such terrible lessons. It is not a small thing. It's not, as it were, a detail. It's not like a wacky Florida pastor. That you've got the largest Sunni state of Saudi Arabia, the most important Sunni state in the world, the most extraordinary closed prison of a society. It's not a detail, it's not a one-off nut job. The Shiite Republic of Iran is what it is, led by the people it's led by. That is not an accident, it's not a detail. The thing that worries me is that although tonight we hear from the fellow panelists here about how Islam is a religion of peace, the fact is that the people who are making the decisions in the religion, the people who are preaching in the religion, the heads of that religion, people like Sheikh Qaradawi, who broadcasts anti-Semitic, the most appalling filth every week on the main networks, that is the faith that's speaking for you guys. I wish that, Ziba, you were on every week on Al Jazeera, but you're not. Qaradawi is. The problem is that Islam is an unstable component, as a religion, an unstable component. 1,000 years ago, the Mu'tazilites tried to reform the religion. They were wiped out. The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not paradigms, but facts. To say that Islam is a religion of peace is to say something based entirely on hope. It's to elevate a hope into truth. And I hope, as you all know, history teaches us that's a very bad thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smart. And that concludes.
Very strong points there. One note I'd make is probably the reason why they don't want to debate Aayan Hirsi Ali is because, according to them, she's an apostate, meaning she should be put to death. An apostate is the punishment for an apostate is death, according to the Islamic religion, according to Sharia law. So if you leave Islam and go to another religion, or I think in general, if you just become an atheist, then you're in trouble. So this is the second part of the debate. He's going to be asking them some questions, and they're going to be debating sort of like an open panel.
And to the question of the notion, Aayan Hirsi Ali, of this not just being about extremists. You concede that there are extremists, but that's, you say, not the problem. What about your opponents? What about your parents? What about Muslims you know who do not adhere to a violent form of religion? Are they, if there's something about the faith themselves, are they embracing spiritually something that is morally an illusion?
Well, my parents and people like my respectful opponents here are ignoring the basic tenets of their religion. When Muhammad, the founder of the religion, called out to all Muslims, and that's how he won most of his wars, by saying, I have been ordered, and all believing men have been ordered to attack and kill and maim anyone unless they testify, unless all men testify to the fact that Allah is the one and only, Muhammad is his messenger. My father disobeys that. Majid Nawaz tried to obey that first and then stopped obeying it, but the fact that that scripture is there and that history of militarism is there belies the notion that Islam is a religion of peace. The point I want to make is Islam is a religion, when you take the scripture, that can be employed to wage war, and Islam as a civilization has known periods of peace, but you cannot, if you pay attention to that history, pay attention to the evidence, continue to say that Islam is a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is only a religion of war. It is both. But in Islam, and that's why we are debating it in the 21st century, there are more occurrences of violence and war and strife and subjection of women than there are in other religions. And my point, our point is, let's not deny it, because by denying it, we don't solve the problem. Let's admit it, and then as intelligent people, take it from there. What is to blame on external factors? What is to blame on the inside?
Majid Nawaz, who was an extremist, now an anti-extremist. Majid, respond.
So, Forgive me for the assumption, Aayan. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you, by the way, but forgive me for the assumption, but do you speak Arabic? Have you studied Arabic grammar? And I'm asking for a purpose which, if you do give me the chance to explain, I will. But first of all, just let me ask you that question. I
don't speak it as well as you do. And I want to know where the question is going before I give a full answer to that. If you want me to quote the Quran, I will.
You may be surprised that I don't know if I speak well or not, but the reason I'm asking is that you just quoted a hadith of the Prophet, and you actually really did exaggerate what he said. And I'll quote to you the exact hadith in Arabic and then translate it. Now, what you quoted was, well, the hadith is, أُمِرْتُ أَنْ أُقَاتِلَ النَّاسَ حَتَّى أُمِرْتُ أَنْ أُقَاتِلَ النَّاسَ حَتَّى يَشْهَدُوا أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Now, what you quoted in the translation was, kill and maim, and he went on and explained. Now, actually, uqatil means to fight. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good hadith. What I'm saying is when we're translating, let's try and be accurate. And that brings me to the point. And that is that I've just thought of a word to describe this, and it's just come to me, so thank you, because I'm going to use it forever onwards. And that word is suspended intelligence. There's a tendency when discussing Islam to suspend the tools that we have learnt and studied, that you have studied as well, that we use to analyze every other piece of scripture and literature in the world. And that is that we recognize that texts do not speak for themselves. We recognize that when we interpret scriptures and texts and books and poetry, that they are contextualized, that we have methodologies to approach them. When we're reading Shakespeare, when we're reading anything, we recognize that there's a way to interpret text, and there are schools of thought and differences over how to approach texts. Now, if we contextualize Martin Luther and say the Reformation was a good thing, despite the fact that he said, kill and slay the peasants, wherever you find them, when they followed Thomas Müntzer, when he was calling for not just breaking away from the papal authority, but also for rebelling against the monarchies and the dictators that they found themselves in. Martin Luther sided with the tyrants against Müntzer and said, kill the peasants wherever you find them. Despite that, I'm prepared to say the Reformation was a good thing. And the reason I'm prepared to say that is that Martin Luther must not be judged by the standards of civilization that we, after an accumulation of thousands of years, have arrived at. He must be judged by the standards of civilization that were around during his time. And that's how society evolves. And we recognize that for every other faith and for every other piece of literature, yet when it comes to Islam, somehow we want to suspend what we've learned about that and quote verbatim from texts.
Yes, we read things in their context. I mean, you read Chaucer in context. Chaucer doesn't have followers. He doesn't have 1.4 billion people who believe everything.
Sorry, I quoted Martin Luther, not Chaucer.
Or are meant to believe everything.
I suppose Martin Luther does have followers.
If you allowed me to speak, I'd address your Luther point. I'll get there, I promise.
Right.
You don't have followers of Shakespeare who insist on, or are meant to be insist on line by line following everything Shakespeare did and believing everything he wrote. That's because it's literature. Actually, what's happening, Majid, is you've put your finger on the problem.
Absolutely.
It's not us that isn't applying the rigorous critical faculties. We're applying them to the Quran as we would to any other work of literature. You're not, because you can't. And the final thing on that, if Majid...
What do you mean that he can't?
Well, because Majid knows very well that
Majid is a believer. And believers are not allowed to contextualize the text.
Can I bring you back to my question? What about Martin Luther?
Is that really true?
If you were allowed to contextualize, you would say some of the things that Muhammad did is crap. You would say some of the things
Majid, is it true
was
that you
great.
cannot...
So you contextualize.
Is that true?
No, it's not true. Now, can I say...
What do you think of Muhammad taking a 6-year-old as a bride? What do you think of that?
I don't think that's a particularly good idea. However, what I would say is that there are many, many people in history that have done such a thing. And what we're talking about here is the failure to contextualize actions for the standards of their time. And I'll come back to the point I made, because, Douglas, you didn't address it despite your protestations that you were going to. Now, let me just ask you again. Martin Luther was a fundamentalist, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
All Christians will agree with you that he was a fundamentalist.
Can I now answer Majid's
Please.
Yes.
And then I want to bring in Zeba.
If there were currently Lutheran, there are Lutherans around, you meet them occasionally in Scandinavia and so on, very nice, very nice it is, and peaceable guys they are by and large. If, however, there was a large proportion of Lutherans somewhere in Scandinavia that started blowing up non-Lutherans, or no, sorry, let's be absolutely right, started massacring peasants, do you think that people would say, hang on a minute, let's not criticise Martin Luther, he did that by the standards of his time, we shouldn't criticise his followers all that much, and we shouldn't point out what he said and so on. No, we just say, you know, don't go and massacre peasants, full stop. It was rubbish at the time, it's rubbish now. It's the same with the Quran.
You're missing the point. If you're failing to judge...
Now, let me bring in your partner.
I just wanted to point out, in terms of when we're talking about the Quran and saying that we can't contextualize it, that's simply not true. That is a debate that's hot in the community amongst Muslim scholars and amongst Muslims themselves. We're debating that very question: is the Quran a living document? Much like it's similar in comparison to, say, the Constitution and the debates that happen around that. Around that. The fact is, scholars say that, you know, when you look at the Quranic Arabic, there can be, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interpretations for every word. There's only certain things in the Quran that scholars agree are concrete, like the concept of God, afterlife, things like that. But beyond that, there is a wide range of interpretation, which is why there is a history that not many people look at, and that's part of the problem, that nobody's actually looked at the history of debate within Islam about every sort of aspect that can come to mind.
I disagree with that. The reason why I disagree with it, it would be more accurate, Ziba, if you said the scholars that you find attractive say that. But there are a bunch of scholars with a great number of following in Islam, all of them are self-appointed, by the way, because there's no hierarchy, there's no seminary of Islam, except a University of Al-Azhar, and we know the products of Al-Azhar. But there are scholars like bin Laden who say we have to take
He's not a scholar
the Quran.
By anyone's
He
measure.
has the greatest following. He has
That's
the
not
greatest
true.
following. The Islamic Brotherhood, Hassan
not true.
al-Banna, when you look at the Sunni Islam, when you look at Ayatollah Khomeini in the 20th century, the most influential guy of Shia Islam, another self-appointed scholar, you have all of it. Sheikh bin Baz, he has the greatest following. Sheikh al-Qaradawi, maybe these are individuals that are not attractive to you, but then it would be more accurate if you stated that. They are attractive to many Muslims, not thousands, but in the millions. And what they say, and that's why they're influential, is they challenge every single Muslim individual. Are you a true Muslim? If you are a true Muslim, you live by what the Quran dictates, you follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad.
Their interpretation,
and those
though.
scholars who insist on that are far more influential, far more powerful than you
Aayan, you just
soft-spoken,
quoted-
wonderful, cuddly scholars.
Well,
100%. And again, it's like Bridget Gabrielle put it beautifully in a video. She said, it's not the silent majority that moves the narrative. It's not going to be the billion Muslims or whatever that are completely peaceful and are not interested in any of this radical extremism. It's going to be the extremists that push the narrative. It's going to be the extremists that take over governments. It's going to be the extremists that commit all of these terror acts and that want to take over the West. And they control the entire narrative. So the problem is you have so many people, even if it's only 25% or 15% of of Muslims, that's still hundreds of millions or tens of millions of people that are dedicated to the destruction of the West. So even if there's a few Muslim scholars that interpret the verse directly, we have a big problem on our hands.
Majid Nawaz.
so Aayan, you just quoted bin Laden as a scholar and Hassan al-Banna as a scholar. Bin Laden, for those of you who don't know, is an engineer, a qualified engineer. So don't know him.
Why don't you define who is a scholar?
Don't know his history. He's a qualified engineer who comes from one of the richest construction families in Saudi Arabia and was educated in the elite private schools of Switzerland and Saudi Arabia. Hassan al-Banna that you referred to was a school teacher. And in fact, what you find common with all of the movements that you're worried about and that I'm worried about and we're all worried about are that they are founded by people who do not have a theological background. Now, for all we think of Al-Azhar and their very conservative views, what we don't find is that Al-Azhar produces the likes of bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna or even Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Maududi was a journalist. Sayyid Qutb, the founder of modern-day jihadism, was a literary critic who came to America on a scholarship in the 1950s to study literature. He was not a theologian. So coming back to the point,
Why don't
please,
you name
Aayan,
a number
don't
of scholars
define
who are
for
influential
the
who are
whole
not?
world who a Muslim scholar is. Because actually the people you refer to were not qualified theologians.
But don't you touch on the problem by admitting this? Don't you touch on the problem that is inherent in Islam after the death of Muhammad? that the problem of who speaks for Islam has not been resolved. It could be the two of you,
Yeah, what's
it
that
could
got
be
to do with
Bin
Islam
Laden,
being a religion
it
of
could be
peace?
Al-Qaradawi, it could be Faisal Shahzad, it could
You
be
know,
me.
Faisal Shahzad is
I
another
wanna go
engineer.
directly-
Sorry,
Aayan,
nothing against
the
engineers in the
question he
crowd.
just
Please
asked,
vote for
what
us.
does
But
that have to
seriously.
do with Islam being a religion of peace? If you're almost making the argument that Islam is what you want it to be, depending on how you behave. So if you behave peacefully, is it not a religion of peace to you?
That is a brilliant question. When you can start by saying Islam is a different thing to 1.57 billion people. And from that general point, you can reduce it to what is it that unifies them. And ultimately, you will get to the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, the Hadith, the Day of Judgment. The belief in the Day of Judgment. And if you take those three concepts, then it's far from a religion of peace. Because you look, first of all, not only at the content of the Quran, in context, fine, I'm willing to contextualize it, but what if other believers are not and they're influential? What if I want to read Muhammad's practices simply as a matter of history, another great figure in history, but more Muslims, millions of Muslims don't want to do that
Right,
and
so-
really
so
want to follow
if
his
you're willing
practice.
that you are
What
able to-
if more and more Muslims invest in the hereafter more than they invest in life? Then we have a problem. And that's why I ask you to vote against the motion. It cannot be only a religion of peace. Because if it
Douglas,
were only a religion of peace, if it were perfect, why would we have this debate?
Douglas,
Why would we
given the
be
long
talking about
run that
reforming
Aayan
it?
had, can you be
I'll be
15 seconds?
extremely
'Cause I'm-
succinct, I promise.
Yeah.
Majid's trying to imply that the whole extremist problem is a sort of misreading by engineers and literary critics. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case, hasn't been historically in Islam, and isn't now. Ayatollah Khomeini, who Aayan mentioned earlier, was not a self-trained engineer, rich boy like Bin Laden, unfortunately, and managed to hurtle a very developed, distinguished culture back in time in 1979 and hurtled this country back into the state it's currently in under these cloaked dictators.
Okay.
The Grand Mufti of Egypt is
All right,
not
we
a
see where you're
self-taught,
going, and I don't need
yet
a list.
he taught
Let's
people the
go
other
back
year
to
that all
Majid.
Muslims should go and fight the Israelis with
Majid.
the
So,
Hezbollah.
sorry, on Khomeini, I acknowledge Khomeini is a trained theologian, and the fact is he came in the 70s, Douglas, and that proves something. What was he so famous for? Khomeini was recognized for bringing a revolution in Shiite theology. And what was the revolution? Those of you who've studied this will know that the revolution was that up until him, Shiites had been avowedly religiously secular because they believed no one had the right to rule in God's name until the Messiah came, and let them wait for that Messiah until the end of time. Khomeini changed that and turned it on its head. And if that proves something, it proves one thing, and that is it was not consistent with Islamic Shiite tradition. What he did was a very modern revolution, influenced by his studies in Europe and influenced by modern European fascism. He broke from tradition, and that's why it was called a revolution. He was not a continuance of Shiite tradition.
It's the fault of the Europeans, in other words. It's external.
No one's saying it's
Remember the victim stages.
No, seriously,
It's not internal.
let's not get
it's
Zeba, I want to ask you something about reforms for Islam. Does Islam need reform?
It needs a renaissance. It doesn't need a reform. Reform in the sense, and the reason I say that is because we have to be careful of our terminology. If we say reform as in Reformation, we're thinking of a Christian context, where you had the Protestants and Martin Luther saying, rejecting the Catholicism and the Pope. But the thing is, in Islam, there is no Pope. There is no centralized authority. So there can't be a reformation in that sense. What there needs to be is a return to genuine Islamic principles, which have been not studied, have not been enforced, and are forgotten. So it's not exactly that.
All right.
But a return to genuine Islamic principles is exactly what Al-Qaeda is advocating.
No, that's not actually what they're... No, that's actually incorrect.
A return, a rebirth,
Al-Qaeda, so the difference between Al-Qaeda
is exactly
I'm
what
sorry,
all those
the
extremist
radio cannot make
organizations
sense of two
are.
voices, and I'm talking now too at the same time. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to make that point, and then I want to hear back. So think 20 seconds.
When you look at the extremist the organizations that we've come to call extremist, what they're advocating when they answer the question, what went wrong? We had this empire, we lost it. How do we regain it? Their answer is a rebirth, Let's go back to the origins, a revival of it. Is that what you want, Ziba?
No, they actually covert the language for their own political purposes. Al-Qaeda is not calling for a return to Islam or to original Islam or anything like that. They're actually using Islam as a cover for their political grievances. When you look and ask Muslims, ask 1.5 billion Muslims, when you look at the mainstream, they're 90%. They're peaceful and fine. When you look at the politically radicalized, when you ask them, what do they fear most? They say Western domination and occupation. But when you ask mainstream Muslims what they fear, they say economic issues, unemployment. There's a clear difference. And so they're not, what we can determine from that is that it's not religion, because religiosity between the two is indistinguishable. How pious they are, indistinguishable. It's the one factor that makes the difference is what they focus on and their grievances against, perceived grievances against the West.
Douglas Murray.
But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings? Which is as follows, is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, you know, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbour and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of, well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
See, this comes back to what you mean by people going back to the origins, and I refuse, as does Zeba, and as we're asking for all of you to do, is to refuse for Islam to be hijacked and monopolized by the bin Ladens of this world who want to tell you what it means to go back to the original sources. Now, if that was the case, then I ask you, why is it that in Bangladesh, where there was a free and fair election, the Islamist party lost roundly? They completely lost the elections. In Pakistan, where there were recent elections, the Islamist alliance in the north that came to prominence after the occupation of Afghanistan, they completely lost all their seats. So the Muslims in two of the most populous Muslim-majority countries in the world, as is the case in Indonesia, whenever they have a chance to vote, they do not vote for the Islamist extremists. And time again in elections across Muslim-majority states, they have proven that their interpretation of Islam, and they are the majority, is not the interpretation of Douglas, Aayan, and bin Laden. Now, I don't want to be in that camp.
All right. I want to take a little break.
I have to say, the biggest proof that he's wrong, that side is wrong, that Islam is a religion of peace, it's just the events of the last year. Syria, Iran, the Houthis, every single Islamist group just exploding with October 7th. And, throughout the years since 2004, I think this debate is, or maybe even a little later, so many Islamist terror attacks have happened. The Islamist basically takeover of Europe. You're talking about a massive migration of Islamists in Europe right now looking to, eventually move to the United States. The West is in jeopardy, and the West and Islam are in an open fight right now.
And move on to the topic and the status of women in Islam. Here in the West, one of the issues that is very complicated for people in coming to terms with what they think Islam is the status of women in Islam. I'd like to go to Zeba Khan. Take that on. You know what I'm talking about.
The perception is that for a lot of people out looking at the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, is that Muslim women are somehow, they aren't, they're subjugated, that they don't, to a point where they are intimidated to ask for their rights and to demand them. But that's not the case. I mean, when you look across Muslim majority countries, if you look at Iran, for example, where there's zero gender gap in education, by the way, men and women enjoy the same amount of education. Obviously, when you're at that level of education, you're aware of what your rights are and what you are demanding. And so
it's unbelievable that she can say that with a straight face, that the women aren't being oppressed in the Islamist regimes. Mind blowing.
So, in Iran, in places like that, they are demanding their rights. They are pushing for them. In places like Afghanistan or Pakistan, where the gender gap is larger, that gap obviously needs to be filled. But there are women who are pushing there as well.
Why should they have to rebel for their rights? Why should they have to ask for their rights? Doesn't happen in any Western country. You don't have to fight. I mean, we fought for our rights, a while back, but at this point, any Western country, you don't have to ask to be as equal as men. And in Islamist countries, you'll never have that. You'll never have women and men completely equal.
It's not. It's women that are stepping up and taking the lead on this.
Other side response? Aayan Hirsi Ali.
Well, when I try to define Islam as a religion, there's expression. What you find in the Quran is expression after expression, verse after verse, and also in the Hadith that women are subordinate to men, that they have a guardian, they need to have a guardian. Their testimony is worth half of that of men. They can only inherit half of what their brother inherits. When it comes to sexual offenses, women are the ones who get, in reality, where Sharia is implemented, and that is not only the practical side of Islam, but also the fellowship side of Islam, everywhere where Sharia is implemented. And there are more places in the world today where Sharia as a family law is implemented, and where it's not implemented on a political level. But in all of those places, you see a subjugation of women. You see honor killings. You see women who are denied education. If you look on a global level, the levels of illiteracy among women in the Middle East is appalling. That's not something that I'm telling you because I'm, I misunderstand Islam, but that is report after report. And the latest one is the United Nations UNDP Human Development Report that was first published in 2002, and that was again published in 2003, 2004. And if you follow these reports, this is empirics. This is not something that I'm imagining. The situation of women in the Middle East, in Muslim countries, is dire. And the principles that underlie it and the practices are Islamic. It's Sharia law in action. And the appalling, the nightmare is women who have fled those countries, who are now in the West, American citizens, European citizens, are subjected to parts of Sharia law. And Ziba, I think that denying that kind of, not just as a matter of debate, but I then try to question, where does your solidarity lie as a woman who grew up in a free country, a free woman, and as vocal as you are, shouldn't you be more solidar with them?
I am.
Ziba Khan.
I am. But I absolutely am, and as all women should be, and actually all human beings should, to demand the rights of equality. In fact, most Muslims want equal rights for the women in their societies. And if it goes to, just go to the research, go to the polls, go to the research on what it says. When you ask men, should women have equal rights? Majority in the countries surveyed, in the Gallup survey, said yes, they should have equal rights, including in Saudi Arabia.
I want to acknowledge that a lot more needs to be done and a lot more needs to be said about eliminating some of the practices that you refer to, Aayan. And I recognize that there are practices in Muslim-majority societies across the world that are repugnant, not just to a Western mind, but generally to any decent, rational human being. But I want to approach this being a man, and the first man on the panel to comment on this question. I want to approach this from a slightly different angle, and that is this, that many of you in the audience are men. And if the law of average was to fall true, then you'd be probably around 50%. Now, how many of you would be comfortable with your spouse, your wife, as your boss at the same time? And it may sound, it may actually be a truism, because for many people in a marriage, the boss is the wife. But the reason I'm asking that question is that even in times like today, many men find that uncomfortable, to be married to their boss. And yet, Aayan, who referred to these practices that were repugnant to us and said that they are sourced in Islam, the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, his boss, his first wife, was his boss. And many people don't know that. And so what I want to demonstrate by this point is that it's a complex...
Oh, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to say that what Muhammad did, well, we don't want to look at that. Don't take a look at that. And then say, actually, this one good thing that he did, let's hyper-focus on that. You don't get to pick and choose where you emphasize what Muhammad did in order to portray a false image of Islam.
There are practices in Muslim-majority societies that we need to reform, but it's too simplistic to trace them back to the life of a man who lived 1400 years ago, and in many of his practices was quite revolutionary for his time, and in others was like every other man during his time. So the fact that Douglas referred to the fact that he had a bride that was underage is something which we can now look back on and say that was an awful practice. But just as we look back on many things that Romans did and say that was an awful practice, just as we look back on many things that Martin Luther did and said that was an awful practice. But we don't judge these men by the standards that we have today.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray.
No, we do, and we should. We should, Majid. And may I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, kind of, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this. That this is actually a very real concern which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain, in my own country. We now have, thanks to to an arbitration act put into law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. Now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following. Six women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically abused by their husbands. They were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so it's all very well to say
just
that it's
actually
something
said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
But the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Majid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
So, Douglas, actually, the irony was, that, as you know well, that the person who came out most publicly in support of those regrettable Sharia courts in the UK was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we at Quilliam opposed their creation. And actually many Muslims in Britain do oppose their creation because it raises the question. Islam has never had a clergy, it's never had a pope, and so when you try and institute Sharia courts as law, the question arises, whose Sharia do you follow? Now that's an internal debate that's going on and raging, and that I'm part of in Pakistan, for example, because there isn't one version of Sharia, and everything you've referred to is bad. We condemn these practices, but the fact is we can't be reductionist, essentialist, simplistic, lack nuance and call it Sharia, because there isn't one Sharia, as you well know, just as there isn't one reading of Shakespeare.
All right, I want to move on.
Think about how sad it is that there are more extremist Muslims today than there were back then. The big Muslim speakers today, Muhammad Hijab, I can list a few, but I'm not so knowledgeable in the subject. Those big figures are way more extreme than these, esteemed, panelists. These panelists are relatively moderates, compared to what we have today. Over 10 years later, it's appalling to see how extreme we've gotten.
And when we come back, we're going to take questions from the audience. All right, so we're going to go to questions from the audience now, and if you raise your hand, what I'll do is take a cluster of questions and then start presenting them to the panel. And I just want to remind you, if you'll get a microphone, please stand up and hold it about 2 fists away from your mouth so that the radio can pick you up. And please keep it as terse as possible, right against the wall there. And blue shirt here, and eyeglasses and green. All right. So you get 30 seconds to ask your question. It makes me nervous that you've got something written down on a piece of paper.
Under 30 seconds, I promise.
All right, go ahead.
Zeba, in your opening remarks, you said that Islamic terrorists are motivated by politics, not religion. Considering that Islamic terrorists make up the majority of suicide terrorists in the world today, what's happening to Muslims politically that isn't happening to any other major religious group that can account for the disproportionate amount of terrorism coming out of the Islamic world?
Bingo. That was a good question.
Yeah,
that is
under 30 seconds.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Your number. I'm going to take the questions and
sorry.
then number 2. Yeah. Yes, I'm ready for you. Oh, I'm sorry. There, with the microphone. Yes, you, sir.
The question was relatively similar, but I'll make it. This has to do with the Muslim community's reaction to suicide bombings. You stated there's 1.5 billion Muslims, and yet the silence of this community on suicide bombings, the justification, the rationalization, the wiggles from the community, from the religious community, from the Muslim states, Arab states and Muslim states, is something that in the West we find puzzling. How would the panelists react to that?
Thank you. And third question?
I hope this isn't too naive, but if religion is if Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
That's a good
Wow, I
question.
think that's a great question, actually. I was trying to get at that with the reform issue, but I just think you put it far more eloquently. So I'm going to take all those questions because I thought they were all good. Seba, do you want to take the response to the first one? Basically, why the preponderance of terrorism, the question you were saying, is committed by Muslim extremists. Why are we not seeing that happening from other groups?
So what I can't say is, I know that it's a complicated question, and so you have history involved, you have different factors that contribute to the answer. What I can say for sure, just based on looking at the studies that come out, is that the level of religiosity, the level of piety of violence of terrorists compared to mainstream Muslims is virtually, there's no difference. So it's literally, when you ask them how practicing they are, how often do they attend services, things like that, it's literally the same. So that can't be the distinguishing factor. But what we do know, as I mentioned earlier, is when you ask them, the one big difference is when you ask them what they fear the most, and they say their perceived idea of Western domination, which is very similar to what we hear from our opposition, a perceived fear of Islamic domination. And so when you compare that to the mainstream, who just want to get a job.
Would the other side like to respond to that question as well? Or to the...
I want to say something here. I think that most people aren't religious, and that's why most Muslims aren't extremists. So if you look at the religious Muslims, she pointed it out perfectly. She actually sort of trapped herself. When you look at the religious Muslims, most of them fear Western domination. Most of them fear all this other stuff. And therefore, when a terrorist goes and commits that act, tying into the other man's question, there is no response. There is no condemnation, because in their heart of hearts, they're like, that guy had it right. That guy was doing the right thing.
The answer that you heard. And if not, we'll move on.
Well, I'll move on.
Okay.
Can I just add something?
Sure. No.
Sorry. There's also, I think, just to add something, that the preponderance has a lot to do with the spread of a certain ideology that I refer to as Islamism, that has arisen in the post-colonial context and that was exported to the Middle East through geopolitics. Now, what happened was that there was a need for a cause to resist against colonialism. And Britain was a secular liberal country. The cause, the ideology that the Arabs adopted, who were resisting, initially it was Arab socialism, Baathism, and that morphed into Islamism, which owes much of its origins to Arab socialism. And so what we find is that the spread of this ideology, pretty much like how post-World War I Europe, with the identity crisis that emerged after the Weimar Republic, led to the growth of fascism in Europe, with fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and totalitarian Stalinism in the USSR. We see the same thing playing out post-empire in the Middle East. So what it's related to is the spread of this ideology that has hijacked the minds of many young Muslims. And yes, Muslims need to do more to challenge this ideology. We are trying to convince them of that. But this is a very modern phenomenon. I remind you, Khomeini is a modern phenomenon, and he created a revolution where he flipped Shiite theology on its head, as are the others. Bin Laden, Sayyid Qutb, they are all modern phenomena.
Okay, Majid, you have awakened the other side on this topic.
Yes, because
Should I keep my mouth shut?
Aayan Hirsi Ali.
Majid, what you're saying is Islamism is invented by the British. Islamism has nothing to do with Islam. External, external, external. Those poor Muslims who are seduced with the Quran and the activities of Muhammad, their own culture, their own convictions, their own history, they have, they are only the victims. Ideas inspire, ideas unite, ideas people bring together. And Muhammad succeeded first and foremost in uniting a disparate Bedouin desert Arab group of people. And they unified and they conquered. And when it worked, it was all Islam. When Muslims were successful, when they conquered lands, it was all great, it was Islam. Now that we're faced with this problem, it's Islamism, and it was created by the British Empire. I just want the other side. I don't think we will ever be able to address this issue if we systematically refuse to acknowledge, and that is what that side of the panel is doing. Let me finish it. Yeah. To systematically refuse to acknowledge the flaws of Islam. I grew up as a Muslim. I left Islam. Why did I do it? Because I couldn't hide away from the blemishes. And I believe we can improve that. I can believe we can inspire young Muslims and the youth bulge. There are millions and millions of young Muslim men under the age of 30. That in itself is a source of violence without it being Muslim. We can inspire them if we can only acknowledge that part of the problem is us, not just the British Empire.
I'm not saying it's the fault of the British. If I was going to say that, I would have joined a very successful
What
British
has
law
Islamism
firm.
got to do with Islam?
I'm saying to you, I would have been a lawyer and I would have got on with my life. I'm taking responsibility for that, and I'm trying to get others to take responsibility for the growth of Islamism within Muslim minds and challenge that. So no one's blaming the British and no one's claiming
The second question was on the topic of, and you almost got to.
He actually did blame the British because he said that these Muslims are looking at the oppression from the West, and she also referred to that, the sort of Western conquest and of Islamic ideas and taking over, and it's causing them to be extremist. It's the same exact methodology that they used to justify October 7th. They said, oh, October 7th was bad, but you have this sort of oppression that the Israelis are putting on the Palestinians, and therefore it's all justified.
To it in your last answer, Majid. But the second question was, where is the clear-cut, broad condemnation of terrorism from Muslim leaders?
Yeah. So there have been many such fatwas or pronouncements against suicide bombings. In many cases, they're not reported. There does need to be more. However, I'll give you an example of why in some cases there aren't more. Now, recently we at Quilliam publicized a fatwa by Dr. Tahir al-Qadri against terrorism, a no ifs, no buts condemnation of suicide bombing and terrorism that Douglas, always a pleasure to speak with you on the panel, supported and was quoted in the press as supporting Dr. Tahir al-Qadri's fatwa against terrorism. Now, the reason why there aren't many more such examples, though there are quite a few, is because prior to Dr. Tahir al-Qadri issuing this fatwa, his colleague, who was also from the same way of thinking, was assassinated in Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber in a mosque where all the other congregants who were praying were also blown to smithereens because he had the guts to simply give a sermon in that mosque condemning suicide bombings. And so this is why many people are scared, because it takes guts, I tell you, to go into Pakistan and try and challenge these extremists. That's a country that doesn't have much rule of law. It's a country that's struggling against the so-called Pakistani Taliban from taking over a third of their country. And they're fighting that fight on the front lines. And there are those who are brave enough just to give a speech to condemn terrorism, and they're blown to smithereens in their mosque while praying. And surely they're religious people. They were praying in a mosque, Douglas. You did support that fatwa, though, didn't you?
I did. It's the only time I've ever done a book review of a fatwa. I'm sorry to say this, Majid, you seem to have just proved our point.
Yes.
Please explain.
Is it? I mean, I'm very grateful. It's a very important and very interesting question, why more people don't stand up. I much admire al-Qadri for that fatwa, as I have other people who have stood up. But the number of times I've spoken to folks behind closed doors and so on, and you say, why aren't you saying anything? They say, because if I do speak up, I'll be killed. Well, I address you again, ladies and gentlemen, to the motion.
No, but, hold on. I'm sorry. Right, hang on. How on earth?
Think about how brilliant that is. The guy literally proved Douglas's point. He said, "Oh, the Islamists are gonna take out. They're gonna kill him if he says anything. They're gonna do terrible things." That's what the jihad is. The jihad forces the silent majority to stay silent, and therefore the entire sort of Islam is hijacked by extremists. And whether you like it or not, whether you say the actual doctrine is this or not, the reality is the extremists drive the narrative, and therefore there's a big problem with Islam.
The sphere of being killed in Pakistan by a minority faction of extremists prove Islam is not a religion of peace.
Let me put it this way. Let me put it this way then.
No, sorry, I've got to, because really what you've just said is really quite absurd, and I've got to clarify. It takes one person to kill all of us here. One person in a suicide bombing. Now, if we were scared of saying what we're saying now because of that one person, it doesn't mean all of us love war and hate peace in any way whatsoever. It means we all fear that one person who could walk through that door with a suicide bomb jacket strapped to his chest.
If we were
That's
discussing
argument,
Quakerism here tonight, does anyone think that when a Quaker said, I'm quite fearful about speaking up against certain things in my faith, come on, this only happens with Islam. There is no other major faith in the world today where it is the case that people are fearful of addressing religion because they're afraid they'll be killed. It's only Islam, and we're saying there's a reason.
I'm being killed by apostates, and many of you who came here tonight came under unusual circumstances. I'm not in government. I'm not a powerful person. I'm a citizen. Just a normal, ordinary person.
Can you explain what you mean by unusual circumstances?
Unusual circumstances. You went through metal detectors to come to a debate in New York. I mean, talk about Quakerism.
That's because it takes one person to get through those metal detectors and blow us up. It doesn't mean the majority of people are terrorists.
Let me finish. The people that I am protected against, and you as an audience too, the individual who wants to kill me because I'm an apostate of Islam is inspired to do that from the scripture of Islam, the example of the Prophet Muhammad, the clergy that preached to him, and the reward he will get in the hereafter that is promised in the Quran. All of that is Islamic. The sooner you admit that,
I'll tell you what he's inspired
the sooner
by.
you admit that, the sooner I can get rid of my bodyguard.
He's inspired. I'll tell you what he's inspired by. Yeah? Right.
This I want to have the last word on this point because I want to go back to the young lady's question.
Sure. So I tell you what, he's inspired by the very same interpretation of Islam that you have. He's not inspired by Islam. He's inspired by your interpretation of it, that is Bin Laden's interpretation of it, that is Sayyid Qutb's interpretation of it. And I've got to say one last thing. I've got to say one last thing. The thing is, you're not the only one on this panel. I have an Al-Qaeda death threat on my head too because I'm saying what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that, and I've been attacked in Pakistan physically for saying this. What I'm saying is, enough to extremism, enough to terrorism. Let's separate Islam from extremism and disempower the minority of extremists who are trying to hijack a good faith.
Douglas, you've had death threats as well. You have also had death threats.
Sure. I mean, one of the points about this area is everyone gets death threats. I mean, it's just an unfortunate thing about this
Zeba and I are going to leave.
I mean, as I say again, I think it speaks for itself. I hope no one threatens a chat.
Can you repeat the question that I liked so much?
Yes.
If Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
My answer is yes, on condition that, first of all, Islam is not a religion of peace, and I hope that we've demonstrated here tonight that it's not. Can it become a religion of peace? Yes, if a number of conditions are met.
But what is it for all of the people who practice it peacefully?
But let me complete the
what
conditions.
What is that faith that they're practicing then?
Peacefully, but
That's the part that I'm not finding in your explanation.
Why are we having, again, over and over again, first of all, in my view, no monotheistic religion, because there's that divider between we and they, and because when that's unified, I mean, there are so many factors within every monotheistic.
So here's the problem. What they want to do is they want to brush the minority aside, the supposed extremists, the very, very small extremists that just so happen end up committing all these terrorist acts. They want to dress that aside, and then they want to say, oh, well, there are peaceful Muslims. Look at the peaceful Muslims. You can't have one without the other. You have to look at the entire thing. And, you know, if you don't want to look at the actual doctrine because you say it's not, the cultural or the context, whatever, if you want to make all that up, right, then you have to look at the people. And if you look at the people that you see on a daily basis are the ones that are the extremists. Again, the extremists control the narrative, and ignoring them is what sort of breeds more extremism.
Religion that make it inherently aggressive. It's not only Islam. But there are a number of factors that in the 21st century combine. Again, there's the history of militarism and the awareness of that. There's the victim status. There's the youth bulge. Let's not forget that. There's the revival of that theology, the revival of the example of the Prophet Muhammad, the investment in the hereafter. And you say, a lot of people practice the religion in peace. What we know is that a lot of people are passive and are actually not practicing their faith, are not practicing Islamic scripture.
Who are you to say who's practicing their faith and who's not?
Let me finish.
It's not for you to decide. I'm Muslim, you're not.
But let me finish. Let me finish. You are not practicing. You are not practicing.
Are you Sheikh?
No, but let me say, you are not practicing.
Let's hear what she says.
Wait a minute. I want
Please,
to finish.
let's hear what her point
You
is.
are not practicing chapter 2 of the Quran, verse 191 and 193. And slay them wherever you find them, and drive them out of places whence they drove you out, for persecution of Muslims is worse than the slaughter of the non-believers.
Chapter 2, let there be no compulsion in religion.
Yeah.
Chapter 2,
okay.
to each community which is given direction as it follows, all of you compete in the performance of good deeds. So which point? We have so many verses. So that's not a reliable argument.
Let's have one
proves
person
my
speak
point.
at a time.
If you read the peaceful,
Aayan, start again because I was talking.
That proves my point. If you read from the Quran and you say it's a religion of no compulsion, and you believe that that verse is practiced by a person like you, you will concede that there are other Muslims who will read the verse that I just quoted and be inspired to engage in acts of violence. And by the way, the verse that you just read, it has a latter part that says, except the unbelievers.
Sure, I'm sure every part does. And I can look at the Old Testament.
But I wanted to complete the answer to the question.
Let's Eva answer this.
Sorry, what was the last point?
Well, my last point was that it is both. It's not just a religion of peace; it's also a religion of war, and both verses prove that.
Okay, but do you want to respond to that, Seb, or do you want to?
I think I'll have to come back.
Okay, Douglas.
That is an important one. Ayan and I and people who make some of the points we make are often accused of taking bits of the Quran out of context. I think you've just seen a very good example of it from the other side. I'm not saying that that isn't a good verse to live one's life by. One cannot just simply quote the verse about there being no compulsion in religion as though it doesn't have a follow-on.
It has
As though it doesn't have a follow-on. And as Ayan has just showed you, it has a follow-on. So I think this gets back to the very important question the lady halfway back there made, which is whether or not this can be a religion of peace. I believe it can be. And when I said earlier there were 3 types of Islam I identified, I said the first one, the scriptures, the life of Muhammad and so on, bad. Second one, Sharia, interpretations, bad. But thirdly, the way Muslims live their lives today, in this country and countries like it, that is our source for hope. And the source of hope for that is that they individually use, like many people do religion. I'm not a religious person, Ayan isn't either. But we recognize the fact that people of religious faith have the right to that faith, should practice that faith, should have no fear of practicing that faith. There's no problem with this. But it's a private matter, and one which people come to very strange private arrangements about. And I just wanted to add this, which is that if those people are going to be able to reform that faith into the religion of peace you're talking about, then yes, we would be the first people to encourage them. But if we're going to have that debate, as I hope we've shown tonight, it has to start with honesty.
Let's do one more round of questions.
It has to start with frankness.
Donna, do we have time for one more round? Yeah. So I'm going to do it again. I would love to hear from an audience member who is a member of the Muslim community.
Yeah.
If you feel like speaking. And not that I'm profiling, but I saw a lot of blonde people raising their hands. And again, I realize it's a complex world.
Jane was blonde.
That kind of profiling is allowed.
All right, I'm going to take something from the left. Yes, blonde person, you can go. Anybody from the? Yeah, okay, go ahead. And then on the right side, yes, okay. Ma'am, I see you. Yep. So again, remember that way that great question was phrased? That's how you do it.
So, for those in favor of the motion, my question is, what she just read from the Quran. You know, you expressed that you didn't agree with it, and clearly, you know, you're interpreting the religion as you will, and in a very peaceful way, which is great. But you know, do you ignore those parts? How do you react to it? You said there were multiple ways, just like we interpret the Constitution, there are multiple ways to interpret what the Quran is saying. I just want to know exactly how you interpret that chapter she just read to us.
Thank you. To that end, I happen to be Roman Catholic, but my wife is Israeli, and my son just went through his bar mitzvah. There was some pretty spicy stuff in Leviticus.
Sure. Yeah. But then Catholicism went through the Reformation and Enlightenment.
Yes.
Hello, I'm from Pakistan. I'm a Muslim from Pakistan, and I just want to comment on the suicide bombings. There's one almost every week. And if you feel that as a nation, after being destroyed repeatedly since 9/11, we would still be sympathetic to extremist sentiments when two of my students were killed in suicide bombings.
But what is your question?
My question is, I want you to consider what the value of socio-economic, cultural factors, political dictatorships. What role do those factors play in making young people susceptible to extremism?
Do you not feel that Majid covered that in his remarks? Because I feel that he did.
Well, I don't think the audience understands.
Let me put it on hold then, and then the third person.
I have a question for Aayan Hirsi Ali. I'm a Muslim woman, and she was referring to the subjugation of women. This has to do with the subjugation of women. I'm from India, and my question is, if women are not educated, in a lot of Muslim countries, that's the problem, that women are not educated. And when they're not educated, they don't know what their rights are. And so they're not going to demand their right. That's the whole point in not educating half the population. But my question to you is, what does that have to do with Islam? Because according to my understanding of the Quran, the first word that was revealed of the Quran to Prophet Muhammad was read. It had to do with education. And the Quran...
So can you give me a question in one sentence? I know you can, so go for it.
My question is, what does that have to do with Islam? Because The Quran doesn't say that, according to my understanding. The education, it doesn't say educate men, do not educate women. Nowhere in the Quran have I found that.
Let's take that last question first.
I want to agree. Thank you so much for that question. I completely agree with you that women in the Muslim world today, not all of them, but most of them, are denied education. The reasons that are given by those who do the denying are Islamic. They refer to the concept of guardianship. So the guardian has the authority to decide whether he sends a girl to school or not, and for how long she goes to school. The main reason in Muslim countries where girls are sent to school, Muslim communities where girls are sent to school, the main reason for pulling them out at the age of menstruation is the fear, the terror that they might lose their virginity. That modesty, sexual modesty that is demanded of girls, which at first it preceded Islam, it was a tribal Arab culture elevated to religion in Islam, where people find within the Quran that in the Hadith, that insistency on her virginity, on her being a virgin on the night of her wedding, that is one of the main reasons that is given. And if sexual emancipation were to occur within the Muslim world, and I want to challenge a guy like Majid Nawaz to take the forefront as a man by saying that you value a partner, a human being, more than her hymen, that would revolutionize Islam completely. It would take, girls would go to school, they would be independent, they would be able to articulate what their rights are, and more importantly, they could make Islam a religion of peace because they would bring their boys up to be employable, to be educated, and to renounce suicide, killings, and martyrdom. Uneducated mothers are mothers whose children, whose boys, bad guys can take advantage of.
We're at the point where normally we move on to our third round. We have...
Wow, that was a very, very strong answer. And her point about education is very, very shocking, that most Muslim women are uneducated, or over 50%. I think she said even more than that. That's pretty terrifying. And yes, like she said, it leads to bad mothers, which leads to bad sons, which leads to suicide bombings.
These two questions standing out there, and I'm going to extend, with everybody's acceptance, a few minutes of this section tonight. Nobody seems to be leaving and no one's asleep. Majid, if you can be very brief to that, and then I want to get to the last question.
To be honest, I value a can of Diet Coke more than a hymen. I mean, really, everything's more valuable to me than a hymen, and especially a woman. So I really don't understand the point of your question there. But allow me to say, however, that every Muslim questioner from the audience today is not a true Muslim, and every one of you who may be a Christian is not really a Christian, and any of you may be a Jew is not really a Jew, because I have the absolute monopoly of defining all three of those religions for all of you. And really, the passages that, because I'm saying this because of the first question, and that is...
She actually should have the authority to define Islam or question Islam, because she was brought up in Islamic culture. Yes, she is now an apostate, but she knows more about Islam and terrorism than anyone else in the room.
The passages that were referred to about fight them wherever you see them. Now the thing is, really, the founding fathers of this great country who wrote the Constitution believed in slavery and were practicing slavery. Now, does that mean that we're going to define the whole of America and its constitution by that practice? Or are we going to contextualize that practice and say that when they founded this country, slavery and abolishing slavery was not at the forefront of their mind?
The biggest problem with his point is simply that most Muslims, or not most Muslims, but a large minority, 10%, 15% of Muslims, sorry for that mistake, do practice what the Quran teaches in terms of violence and suicide bombings and all this other stuff. So you have an insane amount of extremists that are still doing that. Nobody in America still practices slavery.
But later on, it was abolished, and that's an achievement for this country. It's not something that defines this country. And so, likewise, these passages, yes, they can be used and they are used in a problematic way. And it's our responsibility, not just as Muslims, but as decent human beings, to go out there and challenge the abuse of these passages. But we must not forget that, as with every other document in history, it had its context and it was abused. And now when we have gone ex post facto, we can look back to that and judge it with the very civilized standards that we've arrived at and say, that was wrong. Now, perhaps
let me put that.
I may be defined as uncivilized.
I want to put the question as it was phrased to Zeba, which was, how do you filter out? Right, exactly. How do you filter that out? How
do I interpret is what you're asking? Despite what our opposition says, I do have that right. And basically, I look at my faith. I'm sorry, who asked the question? Oh, okay. I asked, I look at my faith and the way I was raised with core Islamic principles, which is how my family raised me and that I determined as an adult were correct, which is compassion and tolerance and plurality and strength and diversity, because we are a diverse population. There are as many interpretations of Islam as there are people. And so the other point I want to make to that is that there are clergy and clerics who are who do stress this. I mean, if you look at 2005, at the Amman message, where 200 Muslim scholars from 50 countries stressed a re-emphasis of Islam's core values of compassion, mutual respect, acceptance, freedom of religion. There is precedent for this, not just for me as a layperson, but from the clergy as well, to reassert these lost, in some areas, lost values.
Douglas Murray.
I do have to. This is a very, very complex one, but this has to be said. Majid's just given the comparison with the founding fathers, and there has to be some clarity about this. This country rightly reveres your founding fathers, but you don't think that their word was immutable or unchangeable. Yeah. You don't believe, I don't think that anyone in this room who criticized Mr. Jefferson now here tonight will be declared an anti-American apostate who can be fit for slaughter. The problem that our opponents have to address, this, is that in a religion which is based on the idea that the Quran was dictated direct by God to Muhammad, and that therefore if you are criticizing the Quran or throwing out bits or pulling it apart, like most Christians and Jews have come to that stage, where pretty much you pick a mix with your holy scriptures, and it's quite a good, humane way around it. But with Islam, if this is the revealed word of God, revealed, it has to be said, as it was shown again earlier tonight, in a particularly obscure and unreadable dialect, which, if it was meant to be understood by the whole of the world, it's a bad place to start. If this were the case, then, as I say, we come back to this problem. The founding fathers said many great things and did some bad things, but you are not committed as Americans not to criticize the bad things they did, and this is a problem our opponents are going to have to address.
And that concludes round 2 of our debate. So here's where we are. We are about to hear brief closing statements from each debater. They will be.
That was a brilliant statement by Douglas Murray. 100% true. The inability to criticize is the biggest problem.
Islam is not a religion of peace, and I woke up to the facts on the 11th of September 2001. Perhaps I should have woken up to the facts earlier, but I admit that I did that then at that time. Talking to people of my faith, Islam, and my friends, and discussing with them, I remember all kinds of fallacious arguments, but I remember one consistent thing, and that was to exempt Islam from any criticism. It was culture, it wasn't Islam. But a religion is born in a culture, and if that culture is not peaceful, then that religion is not peaceful. I was told it's politics. We've heard it tonight many times. It's not the religion. But Islam not only has a pious dimension, but it also has a political dimension, a complex system of laws, a political philosophy on how society should be organized. And if you look at that political system, it's anything but peaceful. What emancipated me from the order to submit my will completely to Allah, which in practice means the concentration of power in the hands of a few, was to learn to think critically, the Enlightenment. Vote against this motion and open up the flows of Islam for debate in order that Muslims, those who are not yet emancipated, may take charge of their own reason, of their own faculty. Vote against the motion that Islam is a religion of peace, and toss that fallacy into the trash can of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Aayan Hirsi Ali. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. Now to summarize his closing position for the motion, her position for the motion, Zeba Khan, writer and advocate for Muslim American civic engagement.
Thank you. Faisal Shahzad, the underwear bomber, and the group of young men that were picked up in Pakistan, all of them were for violence and trying to attack our country and learn how to attack our country elsewhere. But the one thing else that the media consistently forgets to mention, or conveniently forgets to mention, is who turned all of them in. It was Muslims. It was their family. Because that is a Quranic principle, that you stand up for justice, even if it's against yourself. And in this case, someone's son, or several people's sons, or the underwear bomber's father, who was Nigerian and not American, did this, turned him in, and sent word to the authorities. And a Senegalese merchant was one of the first, unreported, but was one of the first people to see the Times Square attempted bomber. Our opponents have a very simplistic outlook on this, on the world and what's currently at stake. They see it being Islam versus the West. But the truth is, it's not. It's between moderates and extremists of all kinds. And I urge you to vote for the motion because the overwhelming majority of Muslims, the facts are clear. They are peaceful, they're mainstream, and they condemn violence against civilians and have no interest in terrorism, which is consistently, as the woman in the audience said, are attacking Muslims, mainstream Muslims, every day brutally and oppressing them because we don't accept their version of Islam. I'm asking for your help as other people, as people of reason and of people of a moderate voice, to support us as we fight them, and we are fighting them, although we don't hear it as often in the media, which focuses on violence and fear. But the fact is, Muslims have always been fighting them.
Zeba Khan, your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace, and here to summarize his position against the motion, Douglas Murray, best-selling author, founder, and director of the Center for Social Cohesion.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a very enlightening, I think, debate tonight. I think we, on this side, made it very clear that we don't think there's a fight between Islam and the West, or Islam and civilization, or anything else like that. We've made a very clear set of points tonight. And one of those points, which I hope people will bear in mind, is we have said repeatedly that it is in Muslims and their critical faculties, Muslims and their behavior, Muslims and their faith, that we have hope. And it is in people like you that we have hope for the future. And if the motion were that Islam a century from now could be a religion of peace, and people would be quoting Zeba and Majid and seminal moments like this, and that they had learned, well, that would be terrific. But at the moment, tonight, you're being asked to vote on whether Islam is now a religion of peace. Is Islam a religion of peace? I think it is very clear that it is not. This does not mean, of course it doesn't mean, that Muslims are all violent. We would never make that point. We never have made that point. Nor does it mean that there isn't hope in the future. Nor does it mean that we have to have continual clashes till the end of time. But it means we have to start by being honest. We have to be frank about what we see in Islamic history, in Islamic conquests, and in Islamic scripts. We have to be frank about that. In societies which Islam dominated, conquered, and subdued the peoples in the Middle Ages, people who were not Muslims were sometimes allowed to remain in those societies, but they were allowed to do so only by having second-class status, dhimmi status. I would ask you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, not to be dhimmis, not to have second-class status, not to vote for things because you think it's polite or because you think you have to say them, but because you think they're true. On that basis, the idea you could vote for the motion tonight is absurd. Islam is palpably, demonstrably, evidently not a religion of peace. Vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace, and our final speaker.
Brilliant job by Douglas Murray there. I wanted to just jump ahead and see who won this debate. I'm assuming it was Douglas Murray. He put on an incredible performance. Aayan Hirsi Ali, Douglas Murray. Let us just see right here who won.
It's all in now. I've been given the results. Remember, the team that changes the most minds is declared our winner. And here it is. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. Before the debate, 41% were for the motion, 25% were against, and 34% were undecided. After the debate, 36% are for the motion, 55% against, 9% undecided. The side against the motion wins. Congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US.
Wow. That was a big differential. And it seems that Douglas Murray always seems to win his debates. Big congratulations to him. He won the first monk debate, the second monk debate that he competed in. He's an incredible debater, probably one of the best that we have on our side. For more, subscribe to Jewish Uncensored. If you want to help us make more of these videos, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/JewishUncensored. That's buymeacoffee.com/JewishUncensored. And let me know in the comments below if you think Islam is a religion of peace. Thank you, and have a good one.